In a small town surrounded by dense forests and perpetual mist, Clara, a young architect, returns to her hometown after years of absence to sell her late grandmother's house. The house, an imposing and ancient structure, holds secrets that no one has ever dared to explore. As Clara deals with memories of her childhood, she begins to notice that something is not right. Voices whisper in the silence of the night, shadows dance in places where they shouldn't exist, and the old clock in the living room, stopped for decades, starts ticking again, always marking the same time. 3:33 a.m. As the days pass, Clara begins to question her sanity. What she discovers in the basement of the house may reveal dark secrets about her family, secrets that should have remained buried. As reality and hallucination blur, Clara must face her deepest fears before the house, or what inhabits it, consumes her completely. The House of the Stopped Clock. Chapter 1. The Return. Clara was exhausted by the time she finally arrived in the small town where she grew up. The thick fog, almost tangible, enveloped the narrow streets, making it hard to see beyond what was right in front of her. Her heart beat a little faster as she passed by the old park where she used to play as a child. Nothing seemed to have changed. The same houses, the same oppressive silence. But something was different. Clara couldn't put her finger on it, but the feeling of discomfort was undeniable. As she turned the corner leading to her grandmother's house, Clara felt a wave of nostalgia mixed with apprehension. The large Victorian house seemed even more imposing than she remembered, its dark windows like eyes watching her every move. The wooden facade was weathered by time, and the ivy climbing the walls gave the house an almost supernatural appearance. "This is ridiculous," Clara murmured to herself as she pulled her suitcase from the trunk. She was an adult now and shouldn't feel intimidated by a house, especially one she knew so well. But as she crossed the rusty gate and heard the creaking hinges, a sense of unease ran down her spine. The old key turned in the lock with difficulty, and Clara pushed open the heavy wooden door. The smell of mold and dust greeted her, a pungent reminder of how long the house had been abandoned. The lights didn't work, so Clara turned on her phone's flashlight as she walked through the hallway. She knew she would have to start organizing the next day, cataloging her grandmother's belongings, deciding what to sell, what to donate, and what to keep. But for now, all she wanted was a hot bath and a good night's sleep. She climbed the creaking stairs and entered the room that used to be hers. Everything was just as she had left it. The old furniture, the patchwork quilt on the bed, the lace curtains yellowed with time. But something bothered her. Clara looked at the oval mirror hanging on the opposite wall. She didn't remember that mirror. Chapter 2. The Mirror. The next morning, Clara woke up with a strange feeling of being watched. She got up and went to the window. The fog was still there, dense as cotton, wrapping the house in a kind of oppressive cocoon. Determined to ignore the feeling, Clara started her day with a strong cup of coffee before beginning the work of cataloging. As she explored the rooms, memories of her childhood came flooding back. The sewing room where her grandmother spent hours, the living room where they spent Christmases as a family, and the basement. Clara hesitated before descending the stairs to the basement. She had never liked that place. Even in broad daylight, the basement had a darkness that seemed to swallow any trace of light. Leaving the basement for later, Clara returned to the hallway, where she found something peculiar. The old clock, which had been stopped for as long as she could remember, was now working. The heavy wooden machine, with its intricate gears and slowly swinging pendulum, marked precisely 3:33. Clara frowned. "This doesn't make sense," she thought. She touched the clock, checking the gears, but found nothing that would explain why it was working. A sense of unease crept over her again. As night fell, the feeling of being watched only intensified. Clara tried to convince herself that it was just fatigue. After all, dealing with the death of a loved one and the pressure of settling family affairs was more than enough to affect her mind. But that night, Clara woke with a start, her heart racing. She had heard a sound, a whisper, or perhaps a moan. She wasn't sure. She got up, still groggy from sleep, and walked down the hallway to the living room. The clock still marked 3:33, the sound of the pendulum loud, echoing through the silent house. When she returned to her room, Clara looked again at the mirror. There was something strange about it. She felt a wave of vertigo as she stared at her own reflection, which seemed distorted, as if it didn't belong to her. And then, she noticed a shadow behind her, moving quickly. She turned instinctively, but there was nothing there. Taking a deep breath, Clara returned to bed, trying to calm her nerves. But as she closed her eyes, the sound of the pendulum seemed louder, and she swore she heard the whisper again, a distant, almost imperceptible call. Chapter 3. Discoveries. The following days passed in a haze of fear and confusion. Clara began to realize that she wasn't alone in the house. The shadows on the walls moved erratically, and the clock, always marking 3:33, now seemed to follow its own time, unrelated to the outside world. Determined to discover what was happening, Clara descended into the basement. The door was stuck, as if decades of rust had sealed it shut. With effort, she managed to open it, and a wave of stale air enveloped her. The basement was exactly as she remembered, full of old boxes, furniture covered with dusty sheets, and a smell of rot. Clara turned on a flashlight and began to explore. At the back of the basement, she found an old cabinet, locked. Using a key she found among her grandmother's belongings, she managed to open the heavy cabinet door. Inside, Clara found a collection of old notebooks, yellowed with age. Most were filled with recipes, trivial notes, and diaries. But one of the notebooks was different. In it were descriptions of strange and inexplicable events, things her grandmother had experienced in the house. The last entry in the notebook was disturbing. "The clock has stopped again, but I feel that it never stopped marking time. There is something in this house, something that hides in the shadows and waits for the right moment to reveal its true nature." Clara felt a chill run down her spine. Everything was beginning to make sense, or perhaps nothing made sense at all. What was clear was that her grandmother knew more than she had ever revealed, and that the secrets of this house were far from being buried. That night, Clara couldn't sleep. The whisper returned, stronger, almost too close. The mirror seemed to be watching her, and the clock, well, the clock hadn't stopped working. Chapter 4. The Revelation. Determined to solve the mystery, Clara decided to spend the night in the living room, keeping an eye on the clock. She settled into a chair, feeling the tension in her muscles as the silence of the house became almost unbearable. For hours, she sat there, with nothing happening, until the clock finally began to turn its gears, emitting a loud click and starting to chime at 3:33 a.m. Clara stood up, her eyes fixed on the clock. But before she could move, she heard a sound behind her. She turned and saw the reflection in the mirror, which showed the room as it should be, but something was wrong. There was a figure in the reflection, an elderly woman with empty eyes, staring directly at her. Clara felt a tightening in her chest. Her breath caught in her throat as she stared at the figure in the mirror. It was her grandmother, but not as she remembered. Something was terribly wrong with her expression, as if it were empty, devoid of any humanity. The figure raised a trembling hand, pointing directly at the clock, and then whispered something Clara could barely hear. "It never stopped. It will never stop marking time." Clara stumbled backward, terror consuming her. She turned to the clock, its gears now spinning at a terrifying speed. The pendulum swung so fast it buzzed, and the shadows in the room seemed to be drawn to it, forming a vortex of darkness. The entire house seemed to vibrate with a sinister energy. Clara felt like she was about to faint, but something within her, a willpower she didn't know she had, made her resist. She ran to the basement, aware that the key to this mystery lay in her grandmother's writings. Upon reaching the basement, Clara grabbed the old notebook, frantically flipping through the yellowed pages. Her grandmother's final words were written shakily, as if she had been terrified while writing. "It's not the clock. It's what it marks. 3:33 isn't just an hour. It's a portal, a bridge between the world of the living and the dead. Something trapped between these worlds feeds on time, waiting for the right moment to escape. The house isn't safe. I imprisoned it, but it always tries to escape. If the clock starts working again, know that it is near. God have mercy on us." Clara's heart raced. She finally understood what was happening. The house wasn't just haunted. It was a prison, and the clock was the key. Something had been locked inside by her grandmother, but now it was trying to escape, using Clara as a means to break free. Chapter 5. The Confrontation. With renewed determination, Clara knew she had to stop whatever was trying to escape. She remembered an old tool her grandmother always kept in the basement, a rusty sledgehammer. She grabbed the tool and climbed the stairs, each step echoing like a drum in the silent house. Back in the living room, the clock was now completely out of control, its gears spinning frenetically, and the pendulum seemed to have a life of its own, swinging with an almost supernatural force. Clara couldn't afford to waste time. With a cry of pure adrenaline, she raised the sledgehammer and brought it down with force against the clock. The impact was deafening. The glass shattered, the gears flew apart, and the pendulum was ripped from its base. The clock emitted a metallic scream, as if it were alive, and then everything went silent. For a moment, Clara thought she had won, that the nightmare was over. But then, a soft, cold laugh echoed through the room. Her grandmother's figure was still in the mirror, but now with a malicious smile. She opened her mouth, and a voice that wasn't hers, a deep and guttural voice, whispered, "You've free time, child. Now it belongs to me." The air around Clara began to vibrate, and the entire house shook. The shadows, once contained, now spread everywhere, engulfing everything in their path. Clara felt an invisible force pulling her toward the mirror, as if she were being sucked into another dimension. Chapter 6. The Final Choice. Fighting against the force dragging her, Clara knew she had only one choice. She shouted against the wind roaring in her ears, "I won't let you take me! I won't let you escape." Still holding the sledgehammer, she turned to the mirror. The reflection of the house, now distorted, showed a dark and ruined version of the place she was in. Clara felt despair creeping in, but deep within her, a flame of resistance burned. Without hesitation, she lifted the sledgehammer one last time and hurled it with all her strength against the mirror. The glass shattered into thousands of pieces, each fragment reflecting a part of the terror that had inhabited the house. But as the pieces fell to the floor, the shadows began to dissipate and the wind died down. The house, once alive with sinister energy, fell into absolute silence. Clara collapsed to her knees, exhausted, feeling the weight of everything that had just happened. She looked around and realized that the shadows were gone, and the clock was completely destroyed, its gears now inert on the floor. Finally, after what seemed like hours, Clara managed to stand up. The oppressive feeling that had lingered in the house was gone, and for the first time in days, she felt she could breathe freely. Chapter 7. The Dawn. The next morning, Clara woke up in the living room. The rising sun shone through the windows, dispelling the fog that seemed to have enveloped the town throughout her stay. The air was fresh and light, and for the first time, the house seemed like just an old house, filled with memories but without the sinister weight that had surrounded it before. Clara knew she couldn't stay there any longer. She hadn't just exorcised the demons of the house, but also those of her own mind. It was time to move on, to leave the past behind and start a new life. With one last look at her grandmother's house, Clara left, determined never to return. As she crossed the gate, one last thought crossed her mind. What if what she had done was only a pause, not an end? But she pushed the thought away, focusing on the future. Clara never knew exactly what she had released that night, but she knew that the clock and the house could no longer haunt her. And as she walked down the street, with the sun rising behind her, she felt, for the first time in a long while, that time was finally on her side. The echo of time. Months had passed since Clara left the small town and her grandmother's house. She had moved to a new city, started working in an architecture firm, and was slowly rebuilding her life. The memories of that dark night and the haunted clock were beginning to fade, becoming something she could almost believe was a figment of her imagination. However, despite all her efforts to move on, Clara could never quite shake the feeling that something was still wrong. Sometimes, in the middle of the night, she would wake with the sensation of being watched, as if an invisible shadow was always lurking. But when she turned on the light, nothing was out of place. The fear that had consumed her in that house had been buried, but a seed of doubt remained. One afternoon, after a long day at work, Clara decided to visit an old bookstore she had found in her new city. It was a small place, with wooden shelves crammed with old and rare books, the kind of place where she could lose herself for hours. As she walked down the narrow aisles, her fingers brushing the spines of the books, something caught her eye. Between two dusty volumes, she found a small brown leather notebook. Without a title or author, just yellowed pages filled with scribbles. Curious, Clara opened it and, to her surprise, saw that the pages were filled with notes similar to those she had found in her grandmother's house. As she flipped through the notebook, her heart began to race. The notes spoke of portals, clocks, and entities lurking in the crevices of time. One passage, in particular, made her stop. If the clock is destroyed, time will find another way to manifest. It adapts, hides, but never disappears. The cycle starts again somewhere else, waiting for the next unwitting soul to release its curse. Clara felt a chill run down her spine. She closed the notebook quickly, but not before seeing the last note, written in shaky letters. Those who interfere with time never escape. They are marked forever. She put the notebook back on the shelf, her hands trembling. She hurried out of the bookstore, the cool air outside not enough to dissipate the chill that now enveloped her. As she walked home, Clara tried to convince herself that it was all just a coincidence, that the notebook had no connection to what had happened at her grandmother's house. But the feeling of being watched, that persistent shadow that never left her, was now stronger than ever. That night, Clara went to bed early, trying to distract herself with a book before sleeping. When she finally fell asleep, a sound abruptly woke her. It was a ticking, soft, almost imperceptible, coming from somewhere in the apartment. She held her breath, her eyes wide in the dark, trying to locate the source of the sound. She remembered the broken clock in her grandmother's house, the pendulum swinging violently, the shadows moving in sync with time. She got up slowly, following the sound to the living room. There, in the corner of the room, a small table clock she had bought at a thrift store was ticking away. With each tick, the clock's hands moved, but to Clara's horror, it marked only one time. 3:33. Clara felt her blood run cold. The sound of the clock intensified, filling the apartment with a rhythm that seemed to sync with her own heartbeat. She knew it wasn't just an old thrift store clock. Somehow, Tom had found her again. At that moment, Clara realized the truth she had feared. No matter where she went or how many clocks she destroyed, the cycle would never be broken. She was trapped, condemned to live in a world where time wasn't just a concept, but a living entity, always lurking, waiting for the right moment to claim what was rightfully its. And as Clara watched the pendulum swing, she felt a familiar presence beside her, a shadow that would never leave her. With a resigned sigh, she closed her eyes and accepted what she knew was coming. Time had found its new victim, and the cycle would begin anew, in a different place, in a different time, but with the same dark inevitability. And so, the clock continued to tick, relentless, waiting for the next soul to fall into its trap. Chapter 8. The New Beginning. The weeks following the return of the clock were a blur for Clara. She tried to ignore the persistent ticking that filled the apartment, trying to convince herself that it was just her mind playing tricks. However, the clock marking 3:33 became a constant in her life, as if time had frozen at that specific moment, refusing to move forward. Clara started avoiding looking at the clock, covering it with a heavy cloth, but the sound penetrated everything, like a rhythmic beat, constantly reminding her that time would not leave her alone. She realized she needed to do something. She needed to take action before her sanity was completely destroyed. Determined not to give in to fear, Clara began obsessively researching the concept of time, portals, and supernatural phenomena. She visited libraries, consulted scholars, and even contacted experts in the occult. Each piece of information led her deeper into a maze of mysteries, but few concrete answers emerged. During one of her research sessions, Clara came across a reference to an ancient ritual that could supposedly free someone from the influence of time-related entities. According to the texts, the ritual was dangerous and required the participant to confront directly the entity that haunted them, in a place where time folded in on itself. Clara knew this might be her only chance to break free, but the idea of performing the ritual filled her with terror. However, realizing that the ticking of the clock was slowly consuming her life, Clara made her decision. She would gather the necessary materials and perform the ritual, confronting whatever was trapped in the clock. Chapter 9. The Ritual. It was a cold, silent night when Clara decided to perform the ritual. She prepared all the items according to the instructions from the ancient manuscript she had found. Black candles, a mirror, a circle of salt, and the clock, now centered in the middle of the circle. The air in the apartment was heavy, as if the very walls were lurking, waiting to see what would happen. Clara lit the candles and began reciting the words she had memorized, feeling each syllable reverberate in her soul. The ticking sound seemed to intensify, as if time itself knew what was coming and was struggling to break free. As the ritual progressed, Clara felt the air around her change. The temperature dropped drastically, and a weight seemed to settle upon her. The mirror placed in front of the clock began to fog up, and Clara realized something was manifesting, something that did not belong to this world. Suddenly, the reflection in the mirror changed. It was no longer the reflection of the room, but a distorted landscape, a place where time did not follow normal rules. Silent lightning illuminated a colorless sky, and at the center of the view, an indistinct figure made of shadows watched Clara with empty eyes. The figure raised a hand, and the mirror began to crack. Clara felt a searing pain in her head, as if her mind were being pulled in all directions at once. She knew she needed to finish the ritual before it was too late. With a titanic effort, Clara raised her voice, reciting the final part of the incantation. The cracks in the mirror expanded, and Clara felt a powerful force being pulled out of the clock. The entire apartment shook, as if reality were on the verge of breaking apart. But then, everything stopped. The ticking ceased, and the mirror exploded into a shower of bright shards. For a moment, Clara thought she had one. The relief was intense but short-lived. From the broken mirror, a dark smoke began to spread, taking shape at the center of the salt circle. The entity had not been destroyed. It had been released. Chapter 10. The Containment. The entity, now freed from the mirror and the clock, was an overwhelming presence, made of pure darkness and emanating an aura of ancient power. Clara felt a mortal chill as she realized she was face to face with the source of all her torment. The entity did not move, but Clara could feel its attention focused entirely on her. She knew there was no time for hesitation. With the salt circle still intact, Clara grabbed the last black candle and, with trembling hands, used it to light a stick of incense. The smoke began to circle around the entity, causing it to writhe and emit a low, menacing sound. Clara then spoke the final words of the ritual, a firm command for the entity to return to the place from which it came. The salt circle glowed with an intense light, and the entity let out a horrifying scream, a mix of rage and pain, as it was pulled back into the clock. Clara struggled to maintain her concentration, knowing that any mistake could be fatal. With a final effort, the entity was sucked back into the clock, which began to vibrate violently before finally exploding into a cloud of black dust. The clock was destroyed, its pieces scattered on the floor. The entity had been contained, but Clara knew this was not a true end. She felt that the cycle had been interrupted, but not destroyed. Time, or the entity that fed on it, still existed, perhaps waiting for a new host. Epilogue: Life after time. After that night, Clara moved once again, this time to a city far away, where no one knew her. She sold or destroyed all objects related to her grandmother's house, determined never to touch that dark chapter of her life again. Still, something inside her had changed forever. Clara was never the same. Although the constant ticking of the clock had stopped, the feeling of being watched never completely disappeared. There were nights when she would wake up startled, swearing she had heard the sound of a pendulum swinging, but when she investigated, she never found anything. The ritual had worked, but she knew some things could not be undone. Now, Clara lived a peaceful life, doing her best to distance herself from what had happened. She avoided clocks, mirrors, and anything that might remind her of the time she spent trapped in that curse. But there was always a shadow in her life, a subtle reminder that, while time could be contained, it could never be completely controlled. And so, Clara continued, living in a state of constant vigilance, waiting for the day when time, or the entity that fed on it, might try to claim her again. She knew that the cycle could start again, somewhere, with someone, and perhaps when it did, Clara would be there to help, to warn, and who knows, prevent time from claiming another victim. But until then, she would live each day as a gift, knowing that, even after facing time, the true challenge was to continue living with the weight of the knowledge she had gained. And so, time moved on, relentless, but now Clara was prepared. The clock was broken, the portal was closed, but the echo of time would continue to resonate, invisible and eternal, waiting for its next opportunity. Clara's story comes to a close, but the presence of time, as an inescapable and mysterious force, remains. This psychological suspense explores what it means to struggle against something as fundamental and uncontrollable as time, leaving the reader with a lingering sense of unease.